Okay, the French government has basically backtracked on their diesel tax they were planning to bring in after 3 weeks of violent protests. The Macron government is already unpopular. When he came into power, he promised a program of reform, and a lot of these reforms have not gone down very well with the rural French voters and those French voters from poorer areas. They seem to benefit the Parisian elite. This tax policy was automatically unpopular because over the last 20 years, French people have been encouraged to buy diesel vehicles because the French government was taxing petrol cars to the hilt and hybrid cars as well for some reason. They were encouraged to buy diesel because they were told diesel was more fuel efficient and they were encouraged by government programs and adverts and the French government and the French manufacturers, which have French government involvement, were churning out diesel after diesel after diesel. And it then transpired in the last couple of years that that was a mistake. Petrol cars are actually cleaner. Hybrids are cleaner. Diesels aren't so clean. They're very, very, very polluting. Even with the modern technologies that can catch carbon and the catalytic converters, diesels are, firstly, it's more expensive to process diesel from crude oil, so that you need more refinery space. So the French refineries were having problems, and secondly, it's more polluting. But the way they've gone about this policy, where they were saying we're going to bring in this tax hike and this fuel rise hike when fuel prices have actually come down, has raised anger in France, as I said in the previous video that I did on this subject. What then it became about was more than just the fuel tax and tax reform. It went down for everything. The fact that rural people feel left behind, the unemployment rate is high, other reforms are unpopular, and the Macron government has done a spectacular U-turn in the last 48 hours, um, because the riots had there was no end in sight for these protests and riots on a daily basis. People have lost their lives. There's been a minimum of 3 fatalities so far. And what happened at the Arc de Triomphe at the weekend summed up poor policing as well. They allowed, the protesters and the rioters just to take over central France for 18 hours. Hundreds of thousands of euros worth of damage. Statues smashed. The Arc de Triomphe, one of the prime tourist locations in France, covered in graffiti and criminal damage. The French police surrendered control. So the French police chief is under pressure. Macron said he vowed he would continue with this policy, but his prime minister has basically said no, we cannot. That this is the worst violence France has seen since 1968. So the worst violence 50 years since the student protests, which got bad. They got to the point where they were going to bring the army out and start shooting people bad. That's how bad it got in 1968. Um, they've already had to postpone the PSG, I think it's Montpellier game at the weekend in Paris. That's been called off, citing security concerns. But this backtracking, it just shows, how unpopular the French government is right now. It's very unpopular. There's obviously a lot of issues going on geopolitically in Europe right now. This reform package, while it is needed, they could do it in a different way. There's reform to welfare, there's reform to workers' rights, trade union laws, tax laws, and the French government over the last 20 years, it doesn't matter what party's in charge, have gone down this reform package program, and the riots have been getting worse. And while there's no significant leader to this protest movement, you've got parties from the left and the right wing spectrums also involved. Social media has been a mobilising tool. It's very, very similar to the London riots in 2011 when social media and BBM Messenger and all done by text message. The young people want to have their voice heard. The rural people of France feel a disconnect. They want to have their voice heard. The poorer, deprived regions of cities and regions in France want to have their voice heard. They feel they're being let down by the politicians and have been for a long time. This fuels the far right and the hard left in French politics. This poorly thought out policy, while it might have the right idea in mind, the infrastructure across France outside the major cities isn't there to implement any kind of change away from diesel back to petrol, or even hydrocar, biofuels, or even electric cars. The infrastructure isn't in place. The government policy for the past 20 years has been going, buy diesel. So previous government policy has caused this problem. The lack of investment in infrastructure outside major cities. Paris, great metro system, great motorway system, great public transit with buses and trams. Outside Paris, outside Lyon, outside Marseille, outside Bordeaux, in the regions, there is high unemployment in some areas. that people are thinking about how you give us jobs first before you start taxing people, because there's high youth unemployment. Um, Certain areas like Lille, the old industrial areas, high unemployment. The refugee crisis. The reform package could have waited or been done differently, and Macron is now very unpopular. He promised much and has delivered little. This is the issue with French politics. These protests are now meaning the far right under the Front National is gaining support yet again. Something that when President Macron was elected, they vowed to stop the trend towards the far right, and the hard left Communist Party. They vowed to stop this under his government, and it's actually done exactly the opposite. It's actually growing those parties. So here we are. The French government has done a U-turn on its tax policy. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you are out in France right now. I want to hear from you. If you've been affected in a way, let's see what people actually think about this, and I'll have some more videos for you soon.